You're listening to Counselors on the Couch, an open conversation between counselors, coaches, and specialists discussing how people just like you can solve a multitude of challenges. Counselors on the Couch is hosted by Dr. Chuck Carrington. We invite you now to join us on the couch to listen in as Dr. Chuck and his specialist guests and experts candidly share insider information on how they help solve the problems that drive people into counseling.
Welcome back. This week, we're going to be talking about forgiveness. And forgiveness is an interesting topic because we all have a different perspective on what that means and what it requires. And do we have to forgive? Can we forgive? What is forgiveness going to do for you? Are you letting your former spouse off the hook? There's a lot to be said about forgiveness. And from my perspective, anyway, forgiveness is an absolutely necessary component to moving forward in any relationship, even in a divorce relationship. I have back with me again, Kathy Ahearn and James Strickland, both gurus of divorce care locally. And we're going to be talking about forgiveness. So as we get started, guys, I just kind of want to throw it out there. Maybe we should define forgiveness, because I think everyone has a unique definition, or we have a canned church definition. So maybe we should talk about definitions in general. And I don't know who would like to go first. I can't, because I'm sitting over here feeling unforgiven by my son. So I don't understand forgiveness at the moment. John's not going to say anything. Okay.
Sometimes it's easier to actually say, what forgiveness is not, than rather than say what forgiveness is. Because so many people have this perception of forgiveness, like, oh my gosh, I'm letting him off the hook. And that's just it. Forgiveness is not minimizing the hurt or the offense that took place. And forgiveness is not about trust. It's not about trusting the other person. You forgive, it doesn't mean you have to trust. And also, forgiveness is not about reconciling with that person and entering back into a relationship with them. And it's not about forgetting what happened to you either. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, forgiveness is not a one-time thing. Forgiveness sometimes has to be done over and over and over. But forgiveness, just a short thing on that is, honestly, forgiveness is letting go of a debt and letting that debt go to God. Somebody has hurt you. And rather than hold on to that hurt, you release the hurt. Forgiveness is about forgiving yourself peace.
Well, that's an excellent way to get started. I hadn't thought about it as we were writing the outline. I hadn't thought about what it's not. Mm-hmm. Dr. James, I know you're going to have a wise thing to tell us. No pressure.
One of my favorite movies is the movie called The Shack. Near the end of the movie, God, who shows up as a grandfatherly type old man, is going to help the guy find the body of his child. And he tells him that he needs to forgive the man who murdered his 6-year-old daughter. And he's saying, I can't. And he says, no, it's not a matter that you can't. It's a matter that you won't. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean, forgiveness doesn't mean that what this guy did was right or what this woman did was right. It's simply taking your hands from around his neck. And so forgiveness, my opinion of it is, at the end of the day, it's a very selfish act in that you forgive someone for your sake, not for their sake. Mm-hmm. You're letting it go. You're refusing to let them control you anymore. You're refusing to let their memories and the pain that they've caused you be in charge of your life anymore. You're deciding to become a whole person by letting it go and moving on. And I'm sure we'll get into more dimensions of this as we go on. But forgiveness is just an absolutely critical component of you being able to heal from your divorce and to move forward.
So just to kind of sum both of those up, forgiveness is not about condoning or justifying or otherwise agreeing with the other person's behavior. It's about letting go of your hurt and your choice to hold them responsibility in your head, in your heart, and you're moving on. You're not rewarding. You're not condoning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, forgiveness is about not trying to control the other person. Mm-hmm. Because many, many times people refuse to forgive because they're still expecting something from the other person. They're expecting an apology. They're expecting amends. They're expecting compensation. They're expecting some sort of justice to be served. And without realizing what you're doing, you're really trying to control someone else. And you're refusing to let the debt go until this person does what you want them to do. But the fact is that you can't control anybody but yourself. And so by controlling yourself and by forgiving that person and letting it go, you're uncoupling yourselves from the debt that they owe you. But more importantly, you're focusing the control back on where it belongs, which is on you. Mm-hmm. Because it doesn't take any self-control to hold a grudge. It takes a lot of self-control to forgive and to let it go and to move on.
Yeah, and a piece of that, too, is when you refuse to forgive somebody, it's like, you want them to be punished. You want them to hurt. You want them to suffer. So you want them in jail.
You want something from them.
You want something from them, but you want them in jail. And you know what? But you're the jailer. So you're stuck right with this person because you have to keep them in that jail. And somebody has also said unforgiveness is like drinking poison and hoping the other person will die. And so it like James was saying, it ties you to this person who has hurt you. Forgiveness is not, and you heard James say about deciding to forgive. Forgiveness, so many people think that forgiveness is a feeling. I have to feel like I've forgiven this person. You know, I have to have that sense of release. But sometimes that release doesn't come. The forgiveness is a decision. You make the decision to forgive. And then in trusting God, you start to take those steps that gradually release you from holding on to that person.
That's an excellent point. I work with a lot of couples that are divided because of a betrayal. They're not necessarily in a divorce, but they're divided over a betrayal. And very, very often I hear the betrayed partner saying, I'm not ready to forgive him yet. That implies that they haven't made the choice yet. They have not mentally come to a place that they're willing to make the choice, because they're not saying he's not ready for me to forgive him yet. It's I'm not ready to forgive him yet. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of goes to what you're saying, Kathy, that it's a choice we make, and we make it because of what's going on inside of us. Mm-hmm.
Again, Kathy, you know, the comment you made, again, I just love that movie, The Shack, because a guy is walking down this trail in the woods holding the body of his lifeless daughter. And, you know, and he keeps saying, I forgive you. I forgive you. And he's talking about the guy who murdered his daughter. I forgive you. I forgive you. And, you know, and God tells him, you know, you may have to say it 1,000 times before the feelings come. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because it goes back to, you know, something Chuck and I have talked about in the past, is that what you expose yourself to determines how you think. How you think determines how you feel. So you've got to change the thinking in your mind, and it has to be a decision that you repeat out loud in order for the feelings to come. The feelings will come in time. The compassion, the empathy will come, and you can tell when you have shifted, because you'll look at them in a similar way that Jesus looked at the people who crucified him, where he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. When you start to feel the empathy and the compassion for the other person, then you truly are free. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, you've now cut yourself free of this huge burden that you were carrying, that without you maybe even realizing it, was truly destroying you. Mm-hmm.
Why does God value forgiveness so much?
Unforgiveness blocks us. We think that it blocks us from God. We think that, but what it is when we hold on to unforgiveness, we're blocking God from our lives. We keep him at arm's length and sometimes because we don't want to forgive. You know, so as far as following, and we think of the Our Father, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. God forgives us. He just forgives us. I mean, again and again and again, his arms are always open to us. But especially when that pulls into us having to forgive ourselves. Sometimes when we're holding on to unforgiveness about another person, there's something in ourselves that we're just not able to forgive. But it is not forgiveness is people hear that and they think they're just repulsed at the thought of forgiving somebody. But if God can forgive us everything that we've done, whether it be big or small or whatever, everything in that instance, Lord, I'm sorry. Boom, you're right back there.
So you're saying that the primary reason God gives us forgiveness is so that we have a way back to him. Mm-hmm. So I'm inferring from that if we have unforgiveness in our hearts, that prevents other people from touching our heart. They have no way into our lives. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it holds and unforgiveness towards another person also holds us back from God.
Right.
Because it's not something that blocks us from our relationship with God.
It's a barrier to relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that God wants us to forgive others because he wants us to live in peace and he wants us to be free. And when you hold unforgiveness towards someone, you're not free. That person is in your thoughts. That person may be in your life. That person is holding you back. You spend an enormous amount of time thinking about the insult. You spend an enormous amount of time thinking about how bad they are or what wrong they did. But yet, when you can forgive them, then you're free from them. There's a scripture in the epistles, and I don't have the reference right off the top of my head, where Paul talks about, I'm such a miserable person, who will free me from this body of death. And that actually comes from a Roman governor during that time. His name was Tyrannius. And one of his punishments for murder was that he would take the person who had been murdered and he would physically tie it to the person who was the murderer. And as the dead body decayed, it would actually destroy the body and the life of the person who had been the murderer. God doesn't want us carrying dead bodies around on us. He wants us to be free. The way you cut that thing off of you is to forgive, because then you're no longer carrying that weight. Jesus talked about this too. He said, look, take my yoke upon you, because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And by giving that unforgiveness to God, it frees you up to move forward. The other thing it does is that it takes you out of the center. There are so many scriptures where God said, look, vengeance is mine, I will repay. People do reap what they sow, and sometimes it takes a long time for that to really come to pass. It's not your job to force these evil acts that they did against you to grow and to yield fruit. It's your job to move on and let it go, because God wants to restore them and loves them as much as he does you.
So that was gross, but okay. I've never heard that.
I have.
Well, I don't read as dark areas of history as apparently the two of you read.
No, I've heard it from James.
Oh, you heard it from James. Well,
yes.
That's one of the risks of being friends with James. You will hear stuff. No, that's actually, as disgusting as that is, that's actually a really good way of viewing unforgiveness.
Well, it is, because you're carrying this thing around with you and you think that you're hurting the other person, but in reality, all you're doing is hurting yourself.
It's toxic.
It's toxic.
So what does that tell us then about the personal perspectives that people hold when they're not willing to forgive? What do you think's going on in their mind if they're willing to carry around a dead body?
They're hurt. The hurt that they're carrying. It's almost like unforgiveness. It may sound strange, but it kind of balances the hurt. If they were to just live in their hurt, they would crumble. But by carrying this unforgiveness with them, it gives them something in which to put that energy, that hurt energy. And so, as with everything else, when we let go of something in our lives, even if it's harmful to us, it leaves a void. So sometimes we're afraid, where is that going to leave me? I'm going to be vulnerable again to this person if I forgive them. It's a protective thing, and it's a possession that they hold on to. And a lot of that is due to misconceptions about forgiveness and what it is.
So there's a lot of control for whatever reason that's going on. That's a good perspective.
Well, like I said, towards the beginning of the podcast, people hold on to unforgiveness because they still want something from the other person. And maybe what they want is for justice to be served. Jesus talked a lot about this, in his parable of the servant who owed his master $1 million, and the master forgave the debt, and then he went out and found someone who owed him $100, and he had him cast in prison. It's not about the size of the insult. We all need forgiveness. We all make mistakes, but we're also all responsible for our own behaviors. And if you just let this stuff go and focus on yourself, then you can begin to heal. It requires that you spend time looking inward. And what unforgiveness does, it prevents you from looking inward because you're always looking outward. Mm-hmm. And you think the world would be right if you could control this other person and force them to do what you want them to do. But the reality of it is that you can't control this other person. The only person you can control is yourself. And so by continuing to focus outward on the debt that they owe you and holding unforgiveness, which, by the way, will eventually turn into bitterness. And the Bible talks about that too, because it says bitterness rots the bones. But by doing that, you're not focusing on the one area where you can have an impact, which is on yourself.
So the anger, the bitterness, the aggression, the depression, whatever it is that is driving the unforgiveness, those are distractions from the hurt that you're holding. So you're looking to take that hurt energy, turn it somewhere else, because then you don't have to look at yourself.
All right.
It's a way to avoid the grieving process.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So how does unforgiveness affect your future then? Not just with that person, but just in general.
Oh, especially when you bring bitterness into it. Gosh, you become who wants to be around an angry, bitter person? So it can actually hurt your other relationships. And it begins to cloud. That's the lens through which you begin to see the world, the lens through which you begin to see your life. So it as far as your future goes, you're so focused on this past offense that you can't move forward.
I don't think we're denying here that there are some people who may be listening to this who've been severely wounded. I don't think we're denying the fact that some people have been truly mistreated, maybe physically abused, financially abused, psychologically abused. And in many cases, I'm sure that they could be considered to be true victims, that it was not of their choosing and it was not of their doing. But the fact is that there's nothing you can do about any of that. The whole purpose and the whole mechanism of healing from divorce is reaching the conclusion that while you may be responsible to everyone, you're responsible for no one but yourself. And so therefore you have to make that intense decision to take care of you, to focus on you, to do what you need to do to heal, to do what you need to do to move forward. And all of this diluted energy that you spend on demanding something from someone else that you're never going to be able to get because you can't control them, it's just wasted effort. And it leads to frustration, and it leads to hopelessness, and it leads to bitterness, and it leads to loneliness. And where are these things going to get you?
Yeah, and as we look, we've seen the anger come in to our groups. The person walks into the room, it's palpable. You can feel that. And a lot of people, that their first initial reaction to forgiveness is, yeah, but you don't understand. My situation is, and forgiveness.
And we've heard it all before.
Oh yeah, we've heard
because nobody's situation is unique. No,
it's not. And I mean, I've seen. Oh my gosh, it's just such anger and with the anger often comes comments about maybe hiring a hit squad or something like that. No, actually, there was one fellow that said he would like to do that, but that fellow that said that over time reached forgiveness. And there was a change in his whole being. But when you hear this, you get how people are hearing this, and they've got such hurt inside them. They're going, yeah, but my situation, how can I possibly forgive? And one of the things that we mention to people is sometimes when we've talked about forgiveness being a decision, sometimes you say you make that decision, and sometimes it's praying to God, make me willing to start forgiving. And sometimes it's make me willing to start forgiving. We can't believe that we could actually, I mean, I remember this from my past. I can't believe, as far as how could I forgive? And it happens over time because you make that decision. And then in my case, it was like several years later, all of a sudden I went, oh my gosh, I was never even aware when it happened, but I forgave. It was one of those things that just happened. But my heart goes out to them. What I would say is, if you hear anything in this today, is to take away just a nugget of hope that maybe someday you can be free from this bondage that you're in.
Well, I think also that, we talk about forgiveness, and I was listening to what you were saying, and Kathy, I agree with you wholeheartedly. But it came to what came to my mind was, okay, I have to forgive everything. Well, I mean, divorce is the gift that keeps on giving. Okay. And it goes back to, Peter came up to Jesus and said, my brother sinned against me 7 times a day. How many times do I have to forgive him? And Jesus said 7 times 70. Now, it's not that Jesus wants us to be keeping a tally and doing math. It's that what he is saying is that forgiveness is so toxic that be quick to forgive anytime you've been insulted, because you just don't want to carry that toxicity around with you. So, as with any one situation, there are multiple insults. Mm-hmm. There are multiple things that have occurred that require forgiveness. And it's the old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So it may require you to go through and sort of do an inventory and find the least offensive thing that you can think of, mm-hmm. and just forgive that so that you can start down the path of forgiveness. Because forgiving all of the gory details of the whole process of divorce and your years of living with this other person, it may be more than you can do in one setting. And it probably is. And I would hate for you to use, well, I just can't do this as an excuse and therefore walk away from it. But think of the small things that you can mm-hmm. forgive. And think of the small areas where you have forgiven. I mean, every time he left the cap off the toothpaste, for years, I'm sure you forgave him for that and you moved on. This is, when we talk to people about this, sometimes they act like they've never heard this before in their entire life. It's a completely foreign concept. And yet we've all forgiven many things in our life, mm-hmm. and we've moved on because they're just not important anymore. Your divorce may feel like the most important thing going on in your life right now because it can be consuming. But 5 years from now, do you still want it to be the most important thing in your life going on right now?
But one of the things about divorce, it's not just an incident. It's a journey.
Absolutely. And
when you say having to forgive multiple times, that other person may not be done yet as far as injuring you.
Oh, and by the way, they don't care.
No, yeah, they don't care. But it's something that if they, you forgive them, and then the next thing you know, they've done something new. And then they've done another thing and another thing. And then if you pull the kids into it, and especially if they're hurting the kids, it's something, there's continually new offenses coming your way. So how do you forgive somebody who is still hurting you? Especially if they're still hurting you intentionally, how do you forgive that person? Sure, you can forgive them for a past offense, but how do you forgive them for each offense as it occurs? How do you do that?
Well, and I think you raise a really good point. And I've heard of stories in the past where, people have had a child murdered or had a spouse mm-hmm. murdered or a loved one murdered. And they go to the sentencing and they say, I forgive you, talking to the person who committed the crime. That doesn't mean the person gets out of jail free.
No.
They still need to go to prison. Okay. And in some cases, they may need to go to prison for the rest of their life. So forgiveness doesn't turn you into a doormat.
No.
Okay. Forgiveness is not a get out of jail free card.
Nope.
It is simply you making sure that you are free and that you're not carrying the burden.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as you go through a divorce, there's going to be many opportunities for you to practice forgiveness. But it also doesn't mean that you should be stupid. You need to protect yourself. You need to, provide, enforce your rights within the law. And you need to make an effort to try to create healthy boundaries so that this person doesn't continue to inflict wounds on you. I mean, if you're in an abusive relationship and every time you come home, your spouse is beating you up, okay, you need to forgive them, but you also need to get out of there.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to call the police.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I just want to make sure that people don't misunderstand that, that forgiveness means that you just stand there and take it and be abused. Mm-hmm. That's not what we're talking about here.
No, forgiveness does not mean not setting boundaries. Forgiveness does not mean you have to like the other person. Forgiveness doesn't mean you have to even talk to the other person.
Well, forgiveness is a great example of setting a boundary.
Yeah.
Because I'm setting this boundary, I am letting this go, and I will not let it infringe on me anymore.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I like to try to explain to clients or to students is all behavior has a purpose. We may not notice it, but we have a reason why we do everything we do. So if we are forgiving somebody, we probably, in our minds, have some sort of expectation for that forgiveness. Knowing what your expectation is, I think, very important as to why you forgive. I have a poster that we have in the other room. I wish I brought it in here. It shows the journey of forgiveness. And it's at the end of the journey that the person, once they've gone through the process of all the hurt and all the pain and all the depression, that morass that they go into, when they come to a place where they decide to forgive, it's then and only then that they are free to make a decision. Do I want to continue in the relationship or not? But most of us were taught in school, the relationship must continue, therefore you must forgive. Mm-hmm. So we got it backwards. So if your motivation to forgive somebody is to obligate them and yourself to a relationship, then you're setting yourself up potentially for more hurt. And it could become a roadblock to being willing to forgive because you're afraid of the relationship continuing. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you are forgiving them because you recognize the bondage it puts you under, the toxicity of the unforgiveness, then you realize that there's a boundary being infringed on you that you're willingly letting happen because you're letting the person's past behavior determine who and what you are and what you're thinking today. So forgiveness is for you. And once you get forgiveness, then you get to decide, do I want to continue with that other person? And sometimes it's a yes.
And in many cases, it's a no.
Yeah.
But how do you know until you've already worked out the toxicity in your heart? You can't really make an intelligent choice if you're bound to the past.
Well, and I think, and we've talked all around this, but we've not really said it. We've talked about forgiveness being a decision, forgiveness being a choice, all these things. And what we're talking about is moving away from the emotional impact and moving to a cognitive approach. Mm-hmm. Because the emotions will come based on the cognitive decisions that you make. And in many cases, it takes days, weeks, sometimes years for the freedom that comes from that decision to forgive until it really shows up. But at the end of the day, it's a cognitive approach. And it's about being ruled by your thinking instead of being ruled by your emotions. Mm-hmm. And when you get to a point that you can be ruled by your thinkings, well, then it makes it easy to establish the boundaries that you need in order to protect yourself. It makes it easy to put these relationships in the right perspective. It makes it easy to maintain a position of safety that you need so that you're not re-injured. But until you get out of the bitterness and the anger and the rejection and the abandonment and the shame and everything else that goes along with that, you're not going to be able to reach that cognitive point where you can actually be a whole person and be safe.
Mm-hmm. That applies to almost everything in our lives that is hurt or fear-based. The way I explain it to clients is we live in the moment. We live in the present, but just like God, we are able to remember the past. We exist in the present, so we comprehend that, but we also can anticipate and hope for the future. So we live on those three different planes, even though we are actually physically present now. And wisdom requires that we're able to do all three. A lot of people suspend wisdom and they become so fixated on the past that their present is actually defined by the past. So I call that past present focused. The present is totally controlled by the past. So they're not living in the here and now. They're living in the there and then, but they're existing in the there and then now. Other people get pie in the sky and they think, I want the future so bad that all they think about is the future. And they get into this almost a fantasy, unrealistic fantasy where they ignore past or present and they're just focused on what they want to have someday. Right. So that doesn't necessarily mean good decisions today because you're focused on something that hasn't occurred yet. And some people live in the moment, just in the present. And so they're focusing on, what's it feel like now? What do I want now? And if you're only focused on the here and now feeling, then you miss out on a lot of nuance. So wisdom says we are aware of the past, how it affected us, so we can gain some wisdom. And then we apply it to the present and we gather the information cognitively and we're aware. And we also acknowledge the future we're heading towards and how our decisions today will affect that. So being present future focused requires that we first reconcile the past. Most people don't reconcile the past. They try to move forward. So, what you're saying, both of you are saying is this past hurt can totally thwart our process of gaining wisdom and going forward with intentionality. Instead, we're becoming reactive based on being stuck cognitively in an event that no longer exists, and we're just rehearsing an echo of it. So that's my psychological slant anyway on that.
The word forget comes in there too. Forgive and forget.
I didn't see that part in the Bible.
No.
In the forgiveness part.
No, but that's what we humans, that's what we have said. Oh, forgive and forget, and because when they say that God forgets, it doesn't mean he doesn't remember. It means that he doesn't hold that against you any longer.
He puts it far from his presence.
Yes.
But he doesn't say he destroys it and obliterates it.
But it's quite different. We don't have to forget what happened, but we can take what happened and maybe reframe it in such a way that it doesn't hurt us anymore. We don't forget what this person has done to us. But then again, we don't carry it around in our present. That's not something we call it. It's not happening now. Sometimes we feel like it's still happening. Sometimes just coming into the presence of that person that hurt you so bad throws you right back into that place that you were at.
It's a post-traumatic stress response.
And so I think part of the whole healing process when we're going through divorce or anything else that has hurt us in our lives is knowledge, is learning as much as you can about the concepts of forgiveness, the concepts of anger, the concept of all these different hurt and everything, so that you can look at them from the front part of your brain and more stepping away from your situation. Because when you are in that hurt, and it's post-traumatic stress or whatever, sometimes was a
complex trauma,
complex, stress disorder, or whatever. There's so many different things out there, but just starting to recognize when you start to feel that whatever it is welling up inside you, start to recognize, oh, this is welling up inside me. Step aside for a moment.
I was sitting here thinking while you were talking, Kathy, and there's a lot of things in life that are very, very important that in their essence are very simple, but yet they've become so complex that they appear to be insurmountable. And you mentioned this thing about forgive and forget. And I think certainly before I went through divorce care and started going through this process, I couldn't really give you a good definition of what forgiveness was. I'd heard forgive and forget. And in some cases, some of the situations were essentially insurmountable to me because I thought that forgiveness was such a complex topic. But it's really very, very simple. And I think the simplicity gets overshadowed by the complexity of the situation. So I can give you an example. If you come and you break into my house, I'm going to forgive you. but I'm also going to have you arrested, and I'm going to hope that you go to jail. And I'm not going to have a relationship with you anymore. And I won't trust you. And you're not a safe person for me. But I can do all of those things and still forgive you.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not going to allow you to force me to carry the burden of what you did to me anymore. At the end of the day, and I said this earlier, forgiveness is a selfish act because I don't care enough about you to allow you to cause me pain anymore.
Or maybe another way of saying is I love myself enough to no longer let you take control.
There you go. That's what I was trying to say, but did it very inarticulately.
Very good.
So I had to say something because he said, while Kathy was speaking, it got him thinking. He didn't say while I was speaking, it got him thinking. So I had to say something.
Yeah.
But I think that was a very profound statement.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You love yourself enough to no longer let the other person take control.
There you go.
It's
That's
really not
the
about
essence of
not
what we're
loving
talking
them.
about.
It's about loving yourself. We all fail at loving ourselves enough. We all do. Even the narcissist doesn't love themselves enough, or they wouldn't be narcissistic.
Right.
Okay, because they're fearful. That's why they do what they do, because they have an absence of healthy love for self.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and taking off on that, you and I talked about this probably a year ago, and I was afraid that by loving myself that I would become arrogant and I would become conceited and I would become, a recluse. But what I have found is that by having a healthy love for self, it actually frees me to be able to love others because I'm truly loving them with no expectation of return. Mm-hmm. It's altruistic. It's, letting the love flow from God through me to them with nothing needed, nothing missing, nothing wanted. That's true freedom.
And that's a healthy boundary. The boundaries are interesting because they not only protect ourselves from being hurt, it protects us from hurting others. Yep. When you love yourself enough that you don't demand or require something from another person before you give to them, then you're actually protecting them. Mm-hmm. Love is the answer. I mean, God defines himself as love. We could do a whole podcast on what love really is. And we are going to do one on narcissism here hopefully really soon because that's a big topic. So knowing what we want from somebody helps us define why we are or are not willing to forgive. Sometimes it is conditioning. When we're children, they say, okay, shake hands and go about your business, basically forgive each other. But they never tell us why we're supposed to forgive, except it's easier for the teacher to manage if the children are behaving. Mm-hmm. And we're supposed to learn to can't we all just get along kind of stuff? But that doesn't work in the adult world. We do have memories. We do have to exist with those memories. We do have to apply them. We don't ignore them. If you forgive and forget, then you lose the opportunity to grow in wisdom from experience. So forgetting is not, I think, healthy. Mm-mm. But reconciling the memory with what you really need or want in life and loving yourself and loving others, that's doable.
Well, and I think you raise a really good point there, Chuck, in that.
I hope so. I was kind of thinking I was losing today.
Jeez.
It's supposed to be about me.
But I think the big thing about, this interplay between forgiving and forgetting, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Forgiveness means that when you remember, it doesn't cause you pain anymore. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to forget. There's a lot of things that have happened in my life that I haven't forgotten. And I look at them sort of like historical fact. Mm-hmm. They are, for the most part, void of any emotion. It's just the history of my life. Yeah. It's just the way it was. Doesn't mean it was right. Doesn't mean it was wrong. Doesn't mean it was good or bad. It's just a fact. It's
a fact because it was, not because it is.
Exactly.
Because it was. It's an echo.
And
but I remember earlier when there were these historical facts that I used to remember, they caused me deep grief, deep pain, deep shame. That doesn't happen anymore because not only have I forgiven the other person, but I've also learned how to forgive myself, which I think is the whole other side of this thing.
Yes.
That we may not have really touched on yet.
That's the big barrier. So that's where we're going. So we're looking at barriers, what's in the way.
Well, and I think a lot of times we don't want to forgive other people because in many cases, the other person may not be the one who's really at fault. The fact is, we can't forgive ourselves. And it's so much easier to hold a grudge against someone externally than to look deep inside and realize how devoid you are as a person.
Because part of the healing process is taking an honest look at yourselves.
And ownership. And
ownership for what your part is in this. And that's hard to do sometimes because it opens ourselves up to, like, oh my gosh, if I forgive them this, then I'm going to have to take a look at what I have done, what my part has been in this. And it keeps distracted from what our part is. You know, we don't see what we have done in this situation. And now this is not, once again, it's not a situation where there's abuse of any sort. And you've been told, I do this because you do that. You know, so that's something that has to be, that's a different issue in itself. But,
well, there are true victims out there.
Yeah.
You know, there are people who get molested by someone that they've never met before, they never knew, and they're true victims. But this is a case where you married somebody, okay? And unless you were in an arranged marriage or a forced marriage, you chose to marry this person of your own free will. So this person may have been, the devil incarnate, and you may have been only responsible for 2 or 3% of all the wrong that went into the marriage. But you got to go back and say, why did I agree to marry this person to begin with? Mm-hmm. And why, what were my deficits that chose me to be attracted to this person? And where are the areas that I need to forgive myself for making the choice that started all this stuff to begin with? So because it all started somewhere.
It's not a blame. It's an acceptance.
We're not blaming anybody else here.
It's not about blame.
It's not about blame. It's just trying to figure out who you are and why you made the decisions that you did.
Mm-hmm. One of the fun things about being a counselor is you get to watch people argue a lot in couples. And there's a theme when people are arguing in their relationship, and that is the other person's doing this wrongly and I don't like it. I mean, that's just the bottom line. That's what they're saying. He or she is doing this. I don't like it. Make them stop. Okay. And they both say basically the same thing. Sometimes one person will say, you're right, I'm doing bad, but they don't change. And so I had to get them to a place where I make them realize the person that you're married to is the person that you're married to. If you married them thinking they were somebody else, that was a mistake on your part. Maybe it's a judgment error. Maybe you didn't look closely. Maybe they fooled you. But bottom line is they probably haven't changed. So accept the fact that who you're married to is who you're married to. I heard a comic talking about, I'm with this person. Yes, they're awful, but sit down and I'll explain to you my 5-year plan to make them better. It doesn't work that way. You cannot make somebody better. So we have to accept the fact that we are in a relationship that's not working. And at least at some level, we chose to be there, or we chose to maintain it, or we weren't being wise enough to recognize we were in danger before things happened. It does not blame. No. Because you can be perfectly innocent. Somebody could totally snow you and you could step into a marriage and be wounded. But 9 times out of 10, you didn't know the person long enough for those red flags to come up.
Or if the red flags came up, you just...
And you thought love conquers all.
You just said, I'm glad he doesn't speak to me that way.
Because he does it at that point.
No.
There's a lot to be said for long engagements. Mm-hmm. People these days don't get engaged very long. They don't date very long. They kind of put the cart before the horse in a lot of parts of relationship. And then they wonder why they grow apart, supposedly. Mm-hmm. They don't grow apart. They just grow aware.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I love this. We used to do premarital weekends for people who were engaged. And one of my favorite stories was, this couple who is saying that, well, opposites attract. And I'm like, well, that's the song of the truly desperate, because the more things you have in common, the greater the potential that your marriage will survive. And if you're complete opposites of each other, why would you marry someone like that? Nothing gets better with marriage. Mm-hmm. And marriage wasn't intended to make life better.
No, and that brings
marriage was intended to make you holy.
Exactly. And really, that just, you sit there and think, oh, he doesn't make me happy anymore. She doesn't make me happy. We did not get together to be made happy, and so that, so in that, you go back to your naive self and you say, I should have seen this. I should have seen that. I should have done this or that. And that is, you've got to forgive yourself saying, no, that's where I was at that point in my life.
And I screwed up. That
is who I was. Yes. And I made bad mistakes, but I made them with the best of intentions that I had, that I was capable of having at that time. So sometimes that's about forgiving yourself, is realizing that you did the best that you could with what you had at that time. And so you made a mistake. So, and forgiveness is such a broad topic, and it goes into so many different aspects. I mean, how many times, honestly, throughout the course of the day, if you were to sit back and look at your day, have you done things that you need to forgive yourself for? Just the course of a normal day.
You say forgive yourself for.
I'm talking about forgive yourself for. Not forgive somebody else for, but forgive yourself. So the reason I'm saying that is because of the fact that, we're unforgiveness is focused on that other person. But you're taking a true look at yourself and you think, there are things that I did that maybe weren't kind today. There are things that I did that weren't to the best of my ability today. So it humbles us, okay? And by us being humbled, maybe, just maybe at some point in the forgiveness process, not in the beginning, somewhere along the way, you can take a look at this person for whom you're harboring unforgiveness and realize, they are a human being. They're doing the best that they can with what they have. It's not an excuse. It's just an honest thing. This person, from their upbringing, may not be capable of behaving in a certain way, or may be formed in such a way that this is their behavior. But you take a look at that person, you realize, that they're doing the best that they can. How can you do that? But imagine if you could do that. If you take a look at this person that has hurt you so much and say, wow, they must be really hurting. And so there's compassion comes into forgiveness also, actually.
How many times when you hurt somebody, did you really set out to hurt them?
Yeah.
Occasionally we will do that.
Yeah.
We'll get mad and we'll lash out. But most of the time when we cause someone else pain, it's because we did it without thinking about how it was going to affect the other person, not because we intended it. And the reverse is true. We receive an awful lot of pain in life from people who did not intend to wound you. One of my mentors used to say, people make a decision in the moment and they make it based on what they think is best for them in the moment. And you didn't enter into their calculus.
Yep.
Most of the pain that we inflict on people or they inflict on us is because we weren't part of the calculus, or they weren't part of the calculus, and they are collateral damage. Unintended harm happens. So the answer to your question, and the biggest hurdle if you're starting the forgiveness process, is how to forgive yourself from all the things you've done to others and yourself and to God. Because if you look at your own state and you look at your own process of forgiving self, you learn how to forgive, because now you have empathy for others. That's why God says, judge not lest you be judged. And it's by our hearts that we're judged, right? How we forgive others that we're judged. We are supposed to examine our hearts and learn from that. If I can't stop hurting people, then why in the world would I think someone else is going to stop hurting me?
Well, I think that's a really good point, Chuck. The job of God is already
2 for me.
Yeah, you're doing great today. You're on a roll.
I'm keeping score right here.
The job of God has already been taken. Okay. And as much as we would like to think, we're not God. We're not perfect. If you really think I'm perfect, go ask my ex-wife. She'll tell you that I'm not.
I did that. I asked your ex-wife. You know what she said? You're awesome.
Yeah, I don't think so. But the fact is that it's very easy for us to look at the world through eyes of black and white. We're perfect we're all good. They're all wrong. We have no faults. It's all their fault. And the reality of it is that that's just not true. That's just not true. There are a lot of areas where each and every one of us have deficits. I think the illusion of unforgiveness is this concept that either there's nothing wrong with me, or we get into this scales type of an approach where, okay, I may be bad, but they're a heck of a lot worse than I am. And you're just deluding yourself. You're lying to yourself, because we all have faults. Everybody's got an issue.
Nobody's good. We're all fallen.
Yeah, it is. And so.
But we're loved.
We are absolutely loved, and we're absolutely valuable, but we are all fallen.
And I don't know how to tell you this. I mean, there's so much pain going through this, and there's so much stress that it is just, if anything, you have a tendency to look externally because you're trying to see the next threat coming after you. But at some point, you got to start looking internally, and you got to start taking care of yourself. And you've got to start realizing that you're moving back to a single life where you're only responsible for you. And you got to make an effort to try to heal from all of that. And forgiveness is, I think, probably the most important component of that healing process.
It is. And sometimes, and one of the things we haven't thrown is there's a big difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. So many times people think that if we forgive somebody, we have to reconcile with them. And forgiveness is a unilateral move, whereas reconciliation is a bilateral. It involves both of you being willing to take that step of not only forgiving each other, but of not doing what you did. And it takes a commitment on the other person's part. It's not so much as them admitting all their errors and you admitting all your errors, as it takes 100% of both of you to come together for reconciliation. So some people are afraid, well, if I forgive them, I have to reconcile with them. And that's
not the case.
No, it's not the case. But how many people don't know that?
Well, again, another excellent point, Kathy. There are people that I have forgiven that I will not be alone with them in the same room because I can't trust them. And they've proven to me that they are completely and totally untrustworthy, and therefore I will not be with them without a third-party witness.
Reconciliation is different than forgiveness. If you think about it, so I'm a businessman. James is a businessman. Kathy, I don't know. I can't remember what it was you did before you got a chance to retire and become a divorce guru.
Actually, I worked at the Catholic Church in the religious ed department.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, you also were. I know. I remember now what you told me about the vultures, right?
Oh, I also worked as a receptionist at a law firm.
That was funny. That's a story we got to get into the podcast at some point, because that's a great story. But in business, sometimes you end up, someone owes you a debt and you can't collect the debt. So you write it off. Okay. So it's a write-off. You have no expectations of collecting on that debt, but you still have to reconcile your accounts monthly with your checkbook, or at the end of the year for your taxes. You reconcile. And a reconciliation is bringing an explanation to all the components, knowing what is there and what isn't there and how it all affects. And you come up with this balance. Okay, that's a reconciliation, bringing all the constituent parts together and understanding them. Repentance is more like forgiving the debt. So you now bring it to a different column. This is an uncollectible debt that you have accepted and you have chosen to put in that column because it brings balance back to your life. So many of us believe that forgiveness obligates.
Doesn't.
And if somebody wants to be in your life and you don't want them in your life and you choose to forgive them and they use that leverage of, well, if you don't let me back in your life, you obviously are not forgiving me. You have resentment or a grudge. That doesn't have to be. You can forgive somebody, but you can put them in the uncollectible debt column and say, okay, I will reconcile it. It'll be fine.
Well, and I think that's a great example because I can forgive you and I can forgive your debt, which is what forgiveness really is.
Mm-hmm.
But if I give you credit again, then I'm stupid. Because if you didn't pay it the first time, why do I think you're going to pay it the second time?
Yeah.
So, and that's the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiveness says, I forgive your debt. But reconciliation only occurs is when you're creditworthy again.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And you're trustworthy again.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people that I have forgiven that I wouldn't trust them a bit further than I can throw them.
But I think I think it's important for people to understand and to know the separateness of forgiveness and reconciliation.
Absolutely, because one is not obligatory to the other.
No, but how many people really believe that if I forgive them, then, oh my gosh, I have to go live with them again. If I forgive them, I have to let them back into my life. It's important that they understand how these two things are separated so that they can focus on the forgiving aspect of it. But people, it's one of those fallacies that people think those two things go together, but they do not go together. And there's different levels of reconciliation. You may be reconciled to the person that you simply don't shudder every time you see them. Not that I have any experience with that.
Or reconciliation may mean that you can be at a social setting with this person and it causes you no pain, but you have no obligation to them either, any more than you would. And I find myself doing this a lot. What would a normal person do? What would I do for another person? You know, would I help them out if they were broken down on the side of the road? Would I, wait a half an hour for an appointment? What would I do for a normal person? Someone that, that I have not forgiven, who yet never insulted me. What is my general level of generosity and my general level of social appropriateness that I would do for any other third party? And that becomes my standard. No more, no less.
And there's another word I'm going to throw in there that is actually on every step of the healing journey is in going through the grief process. It's patience. You need patience in forgiveness. You need patience with yourself. You need patience with the other person. Patience.
You just complicated everything.
Did I?
Yeah, because who wants to be paid? I want to do it now.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And you can do it now, but you're going to have to do it over and over and over and over again. And you make such a great point because, I forgive you. Again, it's going to take time for that feeling to go away, for that anger and that bitterness to go away. And I may have to say, I sure didn't, when I interacted with you this time, I sure didn't act like I had forgiven you. So now I got to forgive myself. And oh, by the way, I may have to ask you for forgiveness because I didn't meet my own standard. Which isn't that a switch? This person has so greatly wronged you, and you're asking them for forgiveness because you didn't meet the standard you would set for yourself.
And that is loving. Jesus talked about loving your enemy and heaping hot coals on their head. When you love somebody, whether they deserve it or not, the young man that's napping over there is supposed to be watching the soundboard. He forgives me all the time because I pick on him mercilessly, right? But if he was angry at me and I was angry at him, more than likely I would go and repent to him fast because I have learned over the years that me repenting to him is more likely going to engender his own ability to repent to me because we both value the relationship. But I have people in my life that I've forgiven them for some pretty awful things, but there's no way they'll ever be in my life again because they themselves are going to bring themselves back into the relationship and do what they do. It's the old scorpion thing, scorpions sting. That's what they do. And some people sting and we don't invite them back into our lives. We have to be wise, but that's not unforgiveness. That's a boundary. But,
one thing that strikes me about forgiveness also presents opportunities to us that we might not have. There's somebody in your life that maybe has hurt you, repeatedly hurt you. And you're naturally very cautious whenever you're around them. But sometimes they have a change in their life and they have a change in their perspective where they stop doing that and they come to honestly realize the hurt that they've caused you. And even if they never say, I'm sorry, you see a change in their behavior towards you. But if you can't forgive that person, you can't see that change. But I've had people in my life that have made such a big change, and it's kind of like people say, how can you be friends with them?
Does somebody have to say they're sorry before you offer them forgiveness?
No.
Right.
That's not, the person could, and sometimes it's very risky to go to a person and say, I forgive you for everything you've done to hurt me. You go to a person, you tell them that, and they'll say, I didn't do anything wrong. So because sometimes you don't, forgiving does not mean you have to tell the other person that you've forgiven them.
Exactly. Forgiveness is something you do in yourself, for yourself, but it also protects others. It's a way of loving people. It's also, more importantly, a way of loving yourself. And it all comes down to, why does God offer forgiveness with us? Because it establishes the opportunity for relationship. Sometimes people don't want the relationship, but you'll never have it if you hold unforgiveness in your heart. And you can't have it with yourself if you hold unforgiveness in your heart.
Well, you make a very good point in that.
Wait,
Which one of us? Because we're keeping score.
Yeah. I'm marking it down here on this piece of
This
paper.
is all going to come out.
No, it's not. I
Yeah.
want to make sure this stays in.
I have heard of situations where people got divorced that years later they got remarried to each other. It's rare, but it happens. And people change. Life isn't static. We're all changing every day. And in some areas we're getting worse, and in some areas we're getting better. But if you have unforgiveness, you'll never be able to recognize the change in the other person, because your opinion of them, your picture of them in your mind is frozen in time. And I've known people who are holding grudges for things that happened 15, 20 years ago. And they're basically looking at today's actions based on a 20-year-old set of data. They're trying to keep that person in jail. And in some cases, maybe they haven't changed and they, need to still be cautious around them. But if we don't forgive others, even if they change, there's no chance for any other relationships in the future. People are going to make mistakes. And yes, a divorce is an enormous insult. And I'm not trying to diminish that. And I'm not trying to ignore that, because I know how it feels. I've been there. But the fact is that people change. And we have to give people the opportunity to come back with a new approach. And they may have to prove it. And you certainly encourage you to be cautious and to give it time to see if it's real or not. But to write someone off through having unforgiveness, 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, maybe they haven't changed. But if they have, then you've missed the potential of a very good relationship with that person.
Well, there's probably no more fertile ground for grudges and unforgiveness in family relationships. Whether it's relatives or your immediate family. We learn about forgiveness from our parents, usually, and our siblings. When we grow up with people, we have opportunity to forgive them all the time. If a parent held everything that their child ever did wrong against a child, they would eventually stop loving that child, probably before they hit 18. And if
some days before 5 o'clock.
Well, we all know, having raised children can be monsters if they don't have some boundaries on them. On the other hand, there are a lot of children who will never love their parents because their parents have never engendered love unless they learn to forgive their parents. And if I didn't have a loving, forgiving heart for my mom, then I remember every time she spanked me, I would forget what I did wrong, but I remember the spankings. And so then I would have a hard time loving my mom. So we practice it on our families. Most of us get that right. We don't always forgive our in-laws or our extended family very well. I think everybody has someone in their family like that, where there's either you're holding a grudge against them or they're holding a grudge against you. And then the family gatherings are tense. But if you can release that, so you go to the gathering, they can be as uncomfortable as they want, but you don't have to live it. It benefits you. I think we could practice, if we think about, if you've had kids, you love your kid. If you have a mom, most of us have had a mom, You still love your mom, even though your mom probably wasn't perfect. I think my mom was next to Mary was the only perfect mom on the planet. But I'm sure most of us have reasons. We could be mad at mom or dad, but we want to love them. Unforgiveness blocks love, which is why God gives it to us. I think we beat the horse to death, but final thoughts.
Forgive us.
Well, that was funny. That one will also stay in. I'm not letting these cut out, even for the blooper reel. That will make sure it's in both places.
The whole idea is we want to be free. We don't want to carry things around with us that hurt us. And honestly, we have a choice. We have a choice to forgive or not to forgive. So don't write off forgiveness. Maybe you need to carry it for a season. You know, where you're at right now, maybe you need to carry it for a season. We're not telling you or judging you if you cannot forgive at this point in time. But what we pray is some seeds are planted that maybe, just maybe, somewhere along the way, a little bit of forgiveness will sneak in there, and a little bit more and a little bit more. And just keep praying to be willing, to be willing, to be willing, to be willing, possibly willing to forgive.
Start practicing it where you can.
Yeah.
I'd never even began to understand the concept of forgiveness until about 5 years ago. I heard a lecture by a guy. His name is E.V. Worthington, and he's a professor of psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University. And he has spent his entire professional career in examining the concept of forgiveness and what does it mean, and what does it mean in different cultures. He's traveled around the world and done research with a variety of different cultures, non-Western societies as well, trying to understand the universality of forgiveness. And he talks about that his mother started a halfway house for homeless people, and one of the participants in the home actually murdered his mother. And he talked about having to forgive that person and the journey that he went through, and having to forgive the person who murdered his mother, who was doing nothing but good for, people who couldn't help themselves. And then his brother went into an enormously deep depression over his mother's loss. And his brother eventually committed suicide. And he talks about having to forgive himself because he didn't feel that he was there as much for his brother as he should have been. You can find, if you do a Google search, you can find him as E.V. Worthington at Virginia Commonwealth University. And he has a whole list of publications that really go into deep detail, much beyond what this podcast is, on what is and what is not forgiveness. It's a lifelong journey. We have insults every day. We give insults every day. So the opportunities are abundant to practice this and to become good at it if you choose to.
I'm thinking of driving on the highway sometimes.
Yes, but it's just such a critical part of becoming free.
Mm-hmm.
It's such an enormous component to becoming a whole person and becoming free. And it's one of these things that you may not understand it and you may not appreciate it until you've done it. But once you've done it, the thought of going back and picking up, that unforgiveness again will become so repugnant to you, because you value your peace and your freedom so much more than you value your angerness and your bitterness. So I'd really encourage you guys to really, truly take this seriously and to make a huge effort. Because if you do nothing else, of all these podcasts that you've heard, if you do nothing else but learn how to forgive, how to forgive others, and how to forgive yourself, it'll set you free.
Mm-hmm.
So we have set before us today, life or death.
Yeah.
And we choose life. Forgiveness brings life.
Awesome, guys. Well, for those who are listening, I appreciate you taking the time. I hope that these words have somehow inspired you to move towards this absolutely necessary step and bring your life back in line, bringing it back online, bring it back to a place where you can move forward and start to have relationships again with trust and with honor without being wounded. Join us again next time, episode 11 of our 12-part divorce saga. We're going to be talking about do-overs. How can I avoid repeating the mistakes I made in the past? So until then, I appreciate y'all coming, and we'll see you next time on Counselors on the Couch.
Counselors on the Couch is brought to you by Virginia Beach Christian Counseling, specialists in family counseling, grief, trauma, and loss. Find us at www.virginiabeachchristiancounseling.com. Counselors on the Couch is produced and directed by John Bell, executive producer Dr. Chuck Carrington, with original music score and mastering by John Tyler Music. The opinions expressed here are of the host and the individual guests and are not necessarily the opinion of Virginia Beach Christian Counseling. If you would like to make a comment or would like to ask to be a guest, please go to counselorsonthecouch.com.